It was a rainy night as I drove home from my shift at the late-night diner. The shift had been quiet, but for some reason, I still had a weird amount of energy. I knew I'd need to take a melatonin to fall asleep when I got home. My usual route home is a scenic road during the day, but at night, it's mostly dark with few light posts. Occasionally, there are small parking lots with cute strips of stores or family-owned restaurants and shops, but these are interspersed with long stretches of forest. I was passing one of the aforementioned parking lots of a well-known deli when I noticed a woman standing under a light post, waving me down in the rain. I slowed down as I realized she was a slightly older woman, probably in her mid-50s. She was very tall, around 5'11" or 6'0", but extremely skinny. I lowered my window and shouted, "Do you need a ride?" She came over to the front door, opened it, and started chanting about how much of a hero I was. I asked her where she was heading, and she replied that she was just going up the road to town. She was soaking wet. She was getting my car all wet, but I like to think of myself as a good person, and I couldn't, in good conscience, leave another woman out there in the cold rain. Picking up a random man, on the other hand, would be a different story. The woman seemed sweet, but as I talked to her, I noticed she was missing a few teeth, which was very off-putting. I started to wonder if she might be homeless. She didn't smell or look like a homeless person, though the rain soaking her and her clothes could have temporarily masked any odor. Her hair was so wet that what might usually have been scraggly and undone was now weighed down and straightened by the water. Either way, the woman was smiling the whole time and didn't seem like a threat. We pulled up to an intersection with a gas station on one corner, so I decided to pull in next to a pump. I figured I might as well fill up. I asked her if she wanted anything from inside, really trying to do my good deed for the week. She replied, "No, thanks, honey." I went inside to pay the attendant for gas and grabbed a snack. I grabbed some seltzers since tomorrow was the weekend. When I got back to my car, the woman was gone. I quickly looked around the tiny gas station lot, but she was nowhere to be seen. She must have run off somewhere. I felt slightly bad, thinking she might be a lost and helpless woman, but part of me also felt a bit relieved. I filled up the tank of my SUV and headed home. When I got back to the house, I went straight into my apartment, which is on the first level of a two-family house. There's a tenant upstairs, and me on the ground floor. The front door was usually left unlocked, with the two doors leading to each apartment being the ones that were locked. I let myself in, out of the rain, and into my apartment. I set the seltzers down on the counter. I wasn't that tired yet, so I took a melatonin and tried to go to bed. Even with the melatonin, though, I was having a hard time sleeping that night. My mind was racing with thoughts, especially about the woman I had picked up earlier and what might have happened to her. At certain points, I heard slight sounds from outside my bedroom, but I dismissed them as typical nighttime noises. The slight sounds I heard were probably from the upstairs tenant. Looking back, I wish I had been more suspicious before falling asleep. I woke up in my dark bedroom, which usually never happens when I take melatonin. I typically sleep like a baby through the night. I sat up, feeling drowsy and really thirsty. I reached for the water on the table next to my bed, and then I saw and heard something across the room. Someone was crouched in the corner of my bedroom, behind a clothing dresser, with their legs folded. I had to be hallucinating. I shook my head, trying to clear my vision. I shook my head violently and made weird noises, even slapping myself in the face. Then, whoever was in the corner stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't scream or say a word. I just sat in my bed in literal shock. What had me questioning my sanity afterward was that there wasn't a single sound from outside the room after the figure left. No footsteps, no door closing. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He picked up, confused about why I was calling so late. I told him what I had just seen, and he said, "Trish, you probably just had a night terror," my dad said. I stayed on the phone with him as I continued to wake up. I left my room and turned on the lights in the living room. It was a small space, and there was no one there. I looked around the entire apartment and confirmed that no one else was present. I started to believe that maybe I did just hallucinate it, but I still slept with the bedroom door locked that night. When I woke up in the morning, I drank some coffee and got dressed for the gym. I went to open the door to the foyer, and I realized the door was already unlocked. My heart sank. What I saw last night, was it real? I did another thorough look around the apartment, confirming no one was inside. Then I went out to my car and opened the back door to put my gym bag in the back seat. That's when I noticed damp, yellow-brownish stains all over the floor, and my blanket that I always kept back there was gone. I wanted to cry or scream. I figured it out. That woman must have snuck into the back seat last night when I was in the gas station. She either somehow unlocked the door to my apartment. I called my dad again, frantic, asking him what to do. He advised me to check and make sure nothing was stolen. If nothing was missing, he said calling the police wouldn't do much. I searched the apartment and found nothing else missing except my blanket from the car. I decided to skip the gym that day. In fact, I stayed bottled up in my apartment for a while after that. I was genuinely disturbed by the incident. Living there no longer felt safe, and by the end of the month, I found a new place to live. A few months ago, during our first year of high school, I found myself agreeing to go with my friend Michael to a house party he was attending. Despite not being invited myself, Michael managed to get me an invitation. Knowing I couldn't drive, I chose to go with him. We arrived at the house late at night. Just as we were about to head inside, Michael suggested I leave my phone in the car. He explained that it could easily get lost or stolen at the party. Reluctantly, I agreed and left my phone behind. Michael mentioned that someone could try to take my phone if I wasn't careful. Though I was confused at first, I nodded and got out of the car. We walked into the backyard where the party was happening. I looked around and saw people smoking, drinking, and possibly even doing drugs in small groups. Michael encouraged me to mingle and say hello to a few people. After a few hours, I realized I had way too much to drink because my vision was completely foggy. As I leaned against the wall of the house for support, I glanced at my watch and saw that it was either midnight or 1 a.m. Knowing it was time to leave, I set out to find Michael. Despite my overwhelming urge to collapse, I scanned the yard for him but couldn't spot him anywhere. I asked a few others if they'd seen Michael, but they all said they hadn't. Deciding to call him, I reached into my pocket to get my phone, but it wasn't there. I cursed myself for leaving it in the car. In the back of my mind, I realized my phone was in Michael's car, which had disappeared along with him. I knew there was only one way to get home: walking. Fortunately, I remembered my house wasn't too far from here, but the chilly fall night made me hesitant. I considered asking someone else for a ride, but I didn't know anyone who could help. So, I decided to stick with my plan and walk home in the darkness alone. I reached the road and started stumbling down the street, knowing I had clearly had too many drinks, as I felt lightheaded and dizzy. A few minutes later, I reached the main street and kept walking. My mind lazily drifted to various thoughts. Why did Michael leave me alone at the party? Why did I listen to his ridiculous idea of leaving my phone in his car? Now I couldn't call him or anyone else. I cursed myself for being so careless with my drinking and getting drunk when I knew I shouldn't have. I stopped walking on the side of the road because I was getting tired, so I crossed my arms over my chest tightly to keep warm. Then, I remembered I could try hitchhiking. I held out my arm and stuck out my thumb, hoping someone would see me. A couple of cars drove past without stopping. As the minutes ticked by, I began to feel uneasy, thinking I might have to start walking again. It was past 1 a.m., and though a few cars drove by, no one stopped. They either didn't notice me or didn't care. I hesitated and considered walking home again, but in my drunken state, it felt too daunting. Just as I was about to give up, a gray truck pulled up and stopped in front of me. I smiled and stumbled towards the vehicle. The window rolled down, revealing an older man with a beard who asked if I needed a ride. Gratefully, I said yes, and told him where my house was before getting into the truck. As we started driving down the road, the man began trying to make it. Small talk, asking what had happened to me. However, I was too disoriented to have a proper conversation and could only manage low mumbles or murmurs. As we turned the corner to my street, away from the party, I started feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this man. Suddenly, we drove past my house. I told him we had just passed it, and my gut screamed at me to get out, but I couldn't because I was too drunk to move. I was about to tell the man to let me out before we got too far from my house, when suddenly he turned to me with a sinister look on his face. "You know, you shouldn't be drunk while you're hitchhiking because you'd make a very easy target," he said, smirking darkly. He reached over and started rubbing my leg. I didn't know what he was trying to do, but I knew it wasn't anything good. Before he could do anything else, we both heard a loud siren behind the car, and flashing red and blue lights flooded the night. Realizing it was the police, I felt a surge of relief. The man panicked and stopped the car, unlocking the doors. I quickly jumped out and ran as fast as I could toward the police officer. I told him the entire story about what had happened. Unfortunately, nothing illegal had happened to me yet, so there wasn't much they could do. The officer explained that he was actually looking for someone in a gray truck who had apparently stolen something from a store. I'm not sure if it was the man who picked me up or someone else, but I was just relieved when the police officer intervened. The officer gave me a ride home, and from that moment on, I decided I wouldn't get so drunk that I couldn't think straight. I learned the importance of being responsible and staying aware of my surroundings, even when enjoying myself. During my college days, I found myself immersed in the vibrant party scene of a major university in upstate New York. While I wasn't part of any sorority, I frequented many fraternity gatherings that defined the social life on campus. Despite having gone through a heavy drinking phase during my college years, I suppose it was fortunate to have experienced it then and moved on. There was an upcoming fraternity party that my friends Deanna and Kayla were eager to attend. I rarely turned down a party invitation, even if I was nursing a severe hangover from the night before. I lived in a house off campus with 3 other girls not affiliated with any sorority or team, just 4 friends renting a place together. We were headed to a Kappa Sigma party, a house located roughly 20 minutes away from campus. We pre-gamed heavily at our house before calling an Uber, splitting the fare among us. During the ride there, we continued drinking, setting the stage for disaster. By the time we arrived at the party, I was on the verge of blacking out. The layout of the house was a blur. It was my first time at a Kappa Sigma event, and my memories from that night are fragmented. I recall fleeting moments, like glimpses of the outside of the house. As I approached the house, I noticed a group of fraternity guys gathered outside. Inside, the living room was pulsing with music from a DJ, and the kitchen hosted 2 beer pong tables buzzing with activity. Later, I learned that I had played beer pong with a random frat guy and spent a considerable part of the night chatting with him in a corner. However, my memories from that point onward are a haze. I can't even recall the last thing before waking up, sprawled on the grass beside a road the next morning. My head throbbed intensely, a sure sign I was still somewhat intoxicated. It was pitch black outside, and I found myself lying near a cluster of trees, seemingly in a wooded area away from the university campus. Up there, besides occasional small towns, it was mostly woods. Fortunately, there were a couple of light posts down the road, so it wasn't entirely dark. As I frantically searched my pockets for my phone, panic set in when I realized they were empty. My crossbody bag was also missing, leaving me with absolutely nothing. I started to freak out, unable to call for help or even check the time or my location. Looking around anxiously, in the immediate vicinity where I had been sleeping, there was nothing around me. My white shirt was smeared with dirt, but that seemed trivial compared to my predicament. I began walking towards the light posts down the road, gradually realizing there were no buildings in sight. I found myself on an unfamiliar back road, feeling uncertain about what to do next. Leaning against one of the light poles, I pondered my options. Eventually, I decided to wait for someone to pass by so I could ask for help. It felt like an eternity. At least 15 minutes passed before I spotted headlights approaching in the distance. Stepping out onto the road, I waved my arms wildly. I waved and jumped frantically to catch their attention. And thankfully, the car slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. Approaching the car cautiously, the driver rolled down the window and asked if I was okay. I explained that I was stranded without a phone and needed a ride home. Without hesitation, he invited me to get in, and I gratefully accepted, expressing my sincere thanks. Curious about my situation, he asked how I ended up stranded. I recounted being at a party, and the next thing I knew, I woke up on the side of on reflection. I realized I shouldn't have disclosed so much. I should have been more ambiguous, not revealing how intoxicated and vulnerable I had been. When the driver asked why I hadn't called for help, I admitted I had lost my cell phone too. He gave me a disapproving look. I glanced back at him, noticing his features for the first time. A thin goatee, a prominent nose, and around 35 years old. I gave him my address, asking him to enter it into his GPS. As he drove, he entered the address into his GPS, muttering quietly to himself. "Okay, here we go." Curious about the journey, I asked how far it was, and he replied, "About 20 minutes." It sounded right, considering the distance from the frat house to our place. I hoped everything would proceed smoothly. I'd arrive home to find Kayla and Deanna waiting with my things. But life rarely unfolds so seamlessly. Throughout the drive, the man maintained a gentle tone, asking me basic questions in his soft voice from the start. His almost whispered voice began to feel unsettling as we continued driving down the same road for what seemed like more than 20 minutes. Concerned, I finally asked him how much farther we had to go. There was a moment of silence before he responded with a soft, and then acknowledged my question. His reply, "Not far," didn't sit right with me. Our house should have been in town, yet we were still surrounded by endless trees along the same back road. I noticed from the corner of my eye that he would occasionally He glanced at me repeatedly, turning his entire head to stare for several seconds before refocusing on the road. Nausea crept over me. "Are you sure you entered the correct address?" I asked. He nodded, then unexpectedly queried, "What color underwear are you wearing?" His hand rested on my knee, gently rubbing it. I recoiled, pleading desperately, "Please don't hurt me. I just want to go home safely." He responded, "Why would I hurt you?" But as he spoke, he veered onto the roadside grass, parked the car, and was about to. He leaned towards me, attempting to encircle me with his arms, but I resisted. Swiftly, I opened the door and sprinted into the woods. Thankfully, I wore my Air Force Ones, making it easier to navigate through the trees. I kept running until I was sure the car's headlights were no longer visible. Then, for the first time, I heard the man raise his voice, shouting into the woods, "Where are you? I just want to be with you." Fear gripped me, and I covered my mouth, not just to quiet my breathing, but out of sheer terror. I waited until I heard the slam of a car door and the engine speeding away. After a few more moments, I cautiously returned to the road, ensuring he was gone. I felt utterly vulnerable, avoiding the man but desperately needing help. I stood at the edge of the woods, watching for another car. Eventually, headlights appeared in the distance. I hesitated until I was certain it wasn't the same car before emerging, waving my arms and shouting for help. The car halted. Inside was another man, older than the previous one, picked me up. I sat silently in the back seat, still shaken. I answered his questions about what had happened, but I could barely speak. Fortunately, he drove me home and dropped me off at around 4 a.m. My friends were waiting anxiously, holding my phone and bag. They had considered calling the police if I hadn't returned by morning. No one knew who I had left with or how I had ended up stranded by the roadside. The boy I had, he denies being the person I left with. In fact, there's no concrete evidence that I left with anyone. Yet, there's no explanation for how I ended up sleeping on the side of the road. After that night, I drastically reduced my drinking, determined to avoid ever needing to hitchhike again. Emerging from the dense, dark forest, I found myself hitchhiking from Leipzig, Germany, to Paris. The driver who stopped was a Frenchman, slightly disheveled with a stubbled chin and a worn-out appearance. Despite his shabbiness, he kindly agreed to take me along in his car, offering me a ride to Paris, where I had an urgent appointment to attend. It was October, and I was 29 years old, just coming from an exhibition of my paintings. He appeared to be around my age, speaking broken English while I had no knowledge of French at all. I was clueless about who he was. The day was pleasant, with mild sunshine under a clear blue sky. A perfect French day for hitchhiking. It was approximately 4:30 p.m., and everything felt warm and comfortable. At a gas station somewhere in France, I met him and gladly accepted a ride in his quaint old car. As we headed towards Paris on the main highway, our conversation revolved around my origins. Suddenly, he leaned across my lap and opened the glove compartment, revealing what appeared to be a stack of passports. He handed me 4 in total. The first belonged to his girlfriend, a beautiful girl who tragically passed away after falling off the back of his motorcycle, he explained. The second passport belonged to another girlfriend who died in a car accident. He then revealed the third passport, belonging to yet another girlfriend who had also passed away. The details of her death left unfinished brain tumor, and the fourth fell off a horse, he said. I'm such an unlucky man. I nodded in agreement, feeling increasingly uneasy as the miles passed. He had in his possession passports belonging to 4 young women. Soon after showing me the passports, he mentioned wanting to take a shortcut to Paris. It wasn't so much a question as a statement. Excellent, I thought, desperate to leave as soon as possible. I imagined we would drive through quaint French villages on secondary roads, passing houses and farms. But instead, we turned onto an improbable dirt road off the main highway. Uh-oh, I thought to myself, feeling uneasy, but I remained silent. Why we both kept quiet remained a mystery, perhaps out of sheer awkwardness. Initially, the road cut through an open field, rolling over the vivid green French countryside. Soon it led us into dense woods, where the road narrowed, instantly darkening as we ventured deeper. The interior of the forest felt eerie. Its dense foliage seemed ideal for concealing secrets. Despite the unease, I couldn't deny the haunting beauty of the woods. The forest was both beautiful and ominous. It was then that my French driver abruptly shouted in broken English, "I don't want to speak English anymore." It was clear this wasn't a request. After that, an uncomfortable silence settled in as darkness enveloped us in the forest. A trickle of adrenaline began coursing through me, awakening my fight-or-flight instinct. With communication now cut off, I pondered silently, knowing I'd have questions as we delved deeper into the dense woods. Despite my unease, I realized I had to. I refrained from asking anything, the tension palpable as the sun quickly faded at 5 p.m. The woods grew darker, and the driver appeared increasingly tense, lost in deep thought. I noticed his lips moving silently, a rigid, snake-like tension in his demeanor. Unconsciously, my hand edged towards the car door handle, a movement surely not unnoticed. The car began to slow without a word spoken. Was this it? Was I going to die now? Did he have a weapon? A whirlwind of questions raced through my mind as life took on an unreal quality. This wasn't how, perhaps, I conveyed my defiance to my captor in some unspoken manner, an instinctual challenge only understood by men in confrontation. I harbored my own inner turmoil and was determined not to yield without a struggle. There would be no pleading or appeals for mercy from me, especially not to this person. I possessed my own reservoir of resilience and strength, toughened by years on the road. The intensity of my gaze communicated a readiness to face whatever came next. In that moment, something primal unfolded between us. A rapid inner calculation unfolded, weighing whether one could overpower, halt, or even end the other. Every factor came into play: bloodshed, strength, and the stark reality of mortality. Yet I sensed these calculations aren't identical when faced with a small, frightened, and vulnerable victim pleading for mercy. Between two uneven adversaries, it devolves into a primal struggle for dominance, a frenzy of panic, scratching, and inevitable doom. It was 5:12 p.m., and the car crawled along at a painfully slow pace. In that tense moment, I found myself entering a strange and unfamiliar mental state, a transformation into a potential threat, unprepared yet resolute. Could my chauffeur sense my thoughts, read my body language, or detect my hand on his grimy door handle? It was a moment of reckoning. Then suddenly, relief surged as we accelerated out of those ominous woods. It's curious how these memories flood back to me now as I recount this. Some details blur in my memory, like whether he mentioned hitting a girlfriend. Did he actually say he used a shovel because she attacked him and wouldn't leave him alone? Did I intentionally overlook the 2 backpacks on the back seat? Or did I imagine those words later? Were there more passports in his glove box than the 4 he showed me? Why didn't I demand he stop the car after the passport incident? As the road widened, we emerged from the dark forest into the setting sun, painting the sky in shades of dark red and orange. The sound of traffic grew clearer, and soon I could see the highway ahead. Across the highway, small houses dotted the landscape. I had lost track of our location entirely. The Frenchman asked if I wanted to stay at his house for the night and have dinner together. A quick, unsettling image flashed through my mind, a glimpse of his grimy basement, a place that hinted at something sinister. Politely, I declined, my first word spoken since the order not to use English. Reflecting now, breaking that command in the woods might have altered my story's ending. It all boiled down to silence. Sometimes silence is necessary to plan the next move. Perhaps one of those faces in the passports, I wondered if breaking my silence would have changed things. Could I have overcome my instinct to stay quiet and pleaded in fear? Would that have fueled the darkness of the potential killer? Who can say for sure? I stepped out onto the side of the highway, watching him drive away as night settled in. I never contacted the police. My lack of French and my overactive imagination made me doubt myself. Yelling into the night sky, I tried to make sense of what had just transpired. It was fully dark now, and I felt utterly drained after that harrowing experience. I drifted into sleep on the side of the highway, waking the next morning with a sense of apprehension about the day ahead. As I looked at my hands, I questioned my own survival. Fast forward 20 years, and I found myself teaching English to a German business student at a cafe on a boulevard in Leipzig, Germany. Somehow, our conversation turned to hitchhiking, prompting me to share my unsettling experience. My student promptly pulled out his smartphone and searched for French serial killers, showing me photos. There he was, Patrice Allegra, the man from all those years ago. I couldn't shake the memory of that unsettling ride with him. His face remained etched in my mind since 1990, a time when reports of a serial killer leaving girls' bodies along French roadsides and highways filled the news. During those days, I had heard warnings from my French girlfriend about the dangers of hitchhiking. As we drove through those eerie woods, I couldn't help but wonder if the missing women and other victims might have been hidden there. Looking back, I regret not going to the police immediately. Since then, I've made attempts, but he's already behind bars now, and the knowledge that they weren't interested weighs heavily on my soul. Perhaps if I had come forward, I could have helped prevent more murders back then. It's a burden I carry. Since that time, I've felt a dark weight within me, haunted by the thought of those souls. Maybe, just maybe, the spirits of those girls escaped with me, desperate to flee the forest.